it's by doing this is where you actually then start to see, whether you can address gaps in the market, whether the market you're trying to address is already absolutely chock-a-block with similar providers, which can provide you with some seriously stiff competition to win any business. Or it might be that you find that there are legislative issues, government or European, which will in themselves not so much of a problem, but what they will do is they will periodically, present almost like a seismic shift in the market that you're trying to address, and so you very much have to keep tabs on them. And so the idea of the competitive environment is, and it's different for almost every business, you define a competitive environment for yourself, and it's by mapping what it is you're trying to achieve through understanding of those three core elements that underpin your business. By mapping those regularly onto the competitive environment, is you can see how your competitive position will be ebbing and flowing, and where there may be opportunities for innovation. So, if you think about the SWOT, typically the competitive environment is the thing in comparison with what you do, what you're capable of. Will changes in that environment will either be a good fit with your business and create an opportunity for you, or might actually present an arising issue or problem, something which is actually going to inhibit or threaten your business. So that's where the threat is in the SWOT analysis. And also then, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, if you do a SWOT, we're really talking about relative strengths and weaknesses, and that's versus your competitors. And so if you think from the benchmark of how I'm trying to address my customers or my clients' needs, which I've identified the unfulfilled market, the competitive environment is rumbling away there in the background, and some days it will be helping me in some areas, and some days it will be, or some months, it will be inhibiting me in certain areas. But then it's a question of, well, that month might impact my ability to address the needs of my customers, but I've got competitors, and those shifts in the competitive environment will affect them as well, and it may affect them subtly differently from the way it affects me, and it may be because of their core skills, or the way where they're based, or anything like that. You could take the example of two competitors competing for some particular service in Pembrokeshire, and it has to be a hands-on service, and one is locally based, and one is based in Swansea. Well, if it's locally based, you can imagine a rise in petrol prices, which is part of the competitive environment, adversely disadvantages the Swansea-based company because they have more travelling cost, more petrol cost associated with servicing the business in Pembrokeshire. So that's a change in the competitive environment which will affect two competitors in slightly different ways. And actually, it disadvantages the Swansea-based business, and so conversely, relative strengths and weaknesses, it relatively strengthens the position of the Pembrokeshire-based business. So you can see there how that type of thing might work. So the example I've got there is, if you're a manufacturer of electric kettles, well, obviously electric kettles use lots of power, they're plugged into the mains, so there's an electrical safety issue around them. And there's water, of course. Water and electricity are not great partners. So lots of regulations about the design of kettles. And the European Commission, not quite regularly, but there are routine upgrades, advisory changes, and then they become mandatory changes in wiring regulations. And so if there was the announcement from the European Commission that there was going to be a change to the regs for electrical wiring for kettles. So if you are environmentally scanning, and if you're in that business, that legislation, particularly out of Europe, if you're serving European markets, so to be typically the CE regulations, which you may be familiar with that concept, if with a CE mark on it, but perhaps you recognise if that's got on it, it probably has somewhere. But it's two curved C's, and the second one has just got a little bar across it, so that's the CE mark. And that controls things like these kind of regulations. So if you're in that business, you'll be very familiar with that type of regulation. So in terms of environmentally scanning, a kettle manufacturer should have scanning for changes in European legislation very much on their radar, very much on their list to scan for. And so companies which are regularly scanning and then spot the change quickly, such they can adapt their designs, they've got a little time then to adapt their design, adapt their production, phase out the designs which aren't compliant with the new legislation, sell off the old stock, maybe at a slight discount. But if you get early enough, you might not even have to sell it at a discount. But you certainly draw a line under the production of the old product and you look to move on your stock. And then in conjunction with that, you bring in a new design, such hopefully so the supply out into the distribution network is not interrupted. And then you move in with a new kettle which adapts the new legislation. So immediately then, you can market your kettle as being compliant with the new European legislation, and you can say, you know, we're one of the few providers who are selling products which are compliant, etc., etc. And so you gain, you're differentiating yourself, you're gaining competitive advantage, and it's likely that if you went into, well, I was going to say Comet, but it won't be Comet. If you're going to go into Currys and you're going to buy yourself a kettle, and one said compliant with the new electrical regulations and the other one didn't, you'd be tending towards the one which is adhering to the new standards. So it's a competitive advantage, and you're likely to build market share at the expense of your competitors who maybe haven't adapted so quickly. And so those companies which haven't adapted so quickly, not only would they perhaps be considered complacent by their customers, they may be left with obsolete stock, which they can't move on, which they can't sell out. Once consumers become aware of that new legislation, normally a manufacturer would know well before a consumer. So once consumers know, they don't want the old stuff, so it's obsolete stock, so you're looking at a stock write-off, big hit on company finances for that year or whatever. And maybe you might even be left with a gap in production. So really, nightmare scenario for that company that adapts slowly, and that's why the company which scans regularly, gives itself time to adapt, gets out into the market with the adapted product or service, you know, can gain competitive advantage and build market share at the expense of those companies that don't adapt so quickly. So, in terms of scanning the competitive environment, the thing about environmental scanning is when you look at it, it feels like it's an overhead. The reality is that scanning is a detailed process that requires a lot of intelligence to do it, and a lot of perception and a good understanding of the business and its situation and those core principles. And that the reality is that environmental scanning will not impact the bottom line or the profitability of the business this week, you know, or even this month. And so what it's doing is it's arguably taking time and resource in the business away from achieving short-term objectives. And so if you take a short-term, so-called short-termist view of managing your business, you'd say scanning, sorry, we haven't got time for it, we can't afford it right now. But the reality is it's a strategic activity which is directed at ensuring the longevity of the business, and therefore it really has to be championed by the organisation's strategist, which typically then is the owner or the managing director of the business. So the owner or the MD knows what the value is, not in terms of short term, but they can override, for example, their sales manager, to say, actually, we are going to do this because it makes sure we're still here next year and in 5 years' time. So we are going to do this, I'm going to lead on it, and I require everybody to engage with it because it's a team effort to do this properly. So you can see someone at the bottom of the organisation is really going to struggle to get this message across if the owner has just a direct or short-term sales background. It can be very difficult to get the message across. Really, the individual driving this needs to be the person at or near the top. So once the owner or the MD is initiating, providing the leadership, then he or she will encourage or even demand participation from staff in many disciplines. For example, the sales team then need to be alert to the subtle changes in their customers' response to their offers, and they need to be having more open discussions with customers, particularly face-to-face, about the way their industry is going and the way their market is changing, and maybe doing satisfaction questionnaires or whatever it might be to make sure they're still satisfied with the product. Whichever way you think is most appropriate. But the sales staff are often the ones who are having the direct or the closest interaction with the customer base. And sales staff can provide a vital source of primary information directly from your customers. So the development staff, if you had R&D staff or people who are developing new services, they need to be aware of scanning for new technologies or new capabilities which could add some value or bring some value into your competitive position within your environment. And the reality is, if you don't do it, your competitors might, and that will put you at a disadvantage. So you need to be scanning for new technologies, new capabilities, new service techniques, perhaps built upon technology, which can allow competitive advantage maybe through cost effectiveness of delivery of a service, which can allow competitive advantage to be built by one or more players within the industry to the disadvantage of the others. And then marketing staff would be monitoring the activity of your competitors. So again, this might be you for all of these things, and you put your different hats on at different times of the day or whatever, depending on what the process you want to undertake. But while you're in marketing mode, you're thinking about my competitors, your competitors. What are they doing? Where are they positioned with regards to this change that I've just detected? You have to assume that they will also be doing the same thing. If they're a good business, they'll be doing the same thing. They'll be scanning, they'll be trying to adapt, they'll detect your innovative activity as soon as it hits the market, and so they might well try to copycat or to adapt the way around or to even try and improve. And because they'll be trying to improve to create their own competitive advantage, you can see that this really needs to be an ongoing discipline, an ongoing aspect of maintaining a competitive strategy. It's not just a one-off thing that you can do, on day one of your business, and then you don't do it again for 10 years. It needs to be done regularly. We'll talk about prioritising that in a minute, but it certainly needs to be done. If not continually, it can't be done continually because you have to go out and sell products or service, but you need to make time for it. You need to say, I'm going to take a day a month where I'm really going to get into this. Or, if it's a wet Sunday and something has been cancelled and you've got some time, say, right, okay, I'm going to put a little bit of time into do a little bit of scanning. Let's have a look, trawl around the internet, see what's new, have a look at the competitors' sites, see if they've changed, see if they've brought new product or service to market, something I need to take notice of, something that may change our competitive position relative to each other. It's time well invested. And don't just browse, aimlessly. Have a plan, know who your competitors are, develop that picture, look at them, keep a record of where they were before so you can see what's changed, so you can understand how they've moved, get a little bit into their mindset, what it is they're trying to do. It'll help you to develop your own ideas. So this is this ugly-looking triangle here. This was something which has come up by a person called Michael Paul.